In 1857, British rule in India faced its greatest threat. Cities rose in rebellion. Soldiers turned their weapons against commanders. The authority of an empire trembled. But within a year, the rebellion was crushed. How Britain regained control reveals the true strength, fear, and brutality behind imperial power. This is the story of how Britain crushed the rebellion. Hello and welcome. I hope you are doing well today. Thank you for being here and for taking time to explore history together. Today's story focuses on the British response to the Indian Rebellion of 1857. This is not only a story of battles, but of strategy, reinforcements, punishment, and the determination of an empire to restore authority at any cost. Understanding how the rebellion was crushed helps explain why British rule changed forever afterward. Before we begin, consider this question. Did Britain defeat the rebellion through military strength alone? Or through fear, division, and overwhelming force? Share your thoughts. And let us begin. In May 1857, rebellion erupted with sudden force, catching British authorities completely unprepared. What had seemed like isolated discontent turned overnight into open resistance. The uprising did not announce itself with formal declarations or clear warnings. It spread through action, rumor, and shock, moving faster than the systems designed to contain it. British officials had believed control was firm. The company's armies were large, its administration detailed, and its authority visible in every district. Reports spoke of order and routine. Yet beneath these reassurances, tension had been building. When it broke, the collapse was swift and deeply unsettling. What had seemed like isolated discontent turned overnight into open resistance. The uprising did not announce itself with formal declarations or clear warnings. It spread through action, rumor, and shock, moving faster than the systems designed to contain it. Garrisons fell with alarming speed. In several locations, Indian soldiers turned against their officers or abandoned their posts. Forts that symbolized authority were overrun or isolated. Weapons and supplies slipped out of company control. Each loss amplified the sense of vulnerability. Communication collapsed almost immediately. Telegraph lines were cut. Messengers failed to arrive. Roads became dangerous. Information traveled slowly and unreliably, carried by frightened survivors and fragmented reports. Decisions were made in darkness, without a clear picture of events unfolding beyond immediate surroundings. In administrative centers, confusion replaced confidence. Officials struggled to understand the scale of the uprising. Was it local or widespread? Was it contained or expanding? British families were among the first to feel the impact. In towns and cantonments, civilians fled their homes, seeking safety where they could. Some crowded into fortified buildings. Others hid with local allies or moved under cover of night. Daily routines vanished, replaced by fear and uncertainty. Homes were abandoned in haste. Personal belongings were left behind. The sound of distant fighting or the sight of armed groups was enough to trigger flight. Safety was no longer assumed. Fear spread rapidly across company territories. Not only among Europeans, but among those who had depended on company stability for work and protection. Merchants hesitated to travel. Farmers watched events anxiously. The normal rhythms of life were disrupted. British officials found themselves isolated in unfamiliar surroundings. Authority that once felt unquestioned now depended on small loyal detachments and improvised defenses. Confidence in systems and regulations gave way to reliance on personal judgment and survival. Power rested not on deep consent, but on assumptions that were now shattered. The rebellion challenged a core belief of company rule. For decades, British control had been presented as secure and permanent. The speed of collapse revealed how fragile that control truly was. In some places, local populations watched cautiously. Not everyone joined the uprising, but many sensed the shift. The sight of company authority retreating altered perceptions. The uprising struck at identity and confidence. Officials who had believed themselves masters of the land now felt exposed. As days passed, the scale of the crisis emerged. Multiple regions were affected. Each new report confirmed that this was not a single disturbance, but a widespread challenge. The sense of panic was intensified by isolation. Small groups of Europeans found themselves cut off, waiting anxiously for relief that did not come. Nights were long and tense. Every sound carried meaning. Every delay deepened fear. Within the company administration, questions multiplied. How had this happened? Why had warnings been missed? Could control be restored? The priority became survival and regrouping. British authority responded slowly at first, hindered by confusion and distance. Orders were delayed. Reinforcements were far away. Local commanders acted independently, sometimes decisively, sometimes hesitantly. Coordination was minimal. The uprising also exposed divisions within the Compagnie's forces. Loyalty could no longer be assumed. Trust between officers and soldiers was strained. Each unit was judged carefully, each movement planned with caution. For British families and officials, the experience left a lasting impression. The illusion of safety had been broken. The sense of being untouchable rulers vanished in the face of real danger. Fear reshaped behavior and hardened attitudes. The panic of 1857 was not only about immediate threat. It was about realization. That control rested on unstable foundations. That authority without understanding was vulnerable. That resentment long ignored could erupt suddenly. As the initial shock faded, determination replaced panic. Plans were drawn, reinforcements summoned, and retaliation prepared. The memory of those first days remained vivid. They revealed how quickly power could unravel. The rebellion exposed the distance between administration and acceptance. Shock and panic after the uprising of 1857 marked a turning point. They shattered confidence and reshaped imperial thinking. The experience would influence policy, military organization, and governance for decades to come. The rebellion did not merely threaten territory. It threatened belief. Belief in permanence. Belief in superiority. Belief that rule could continue unchanged. In those early weeks, as garrisons fell and families fled, British control was revealed as something fragile, dependent, and deeply contested. The uprising challenged assumptions that had guided company rule for generations. From that moment on, empire would be governed with greater fear, greater force, and greater distance. The shock of 1857 ensured that British rule would never again be exercised with the same confidence. The panic subsided only when force returned. But the lesson remained. Control was not secure by default. It had to be defended, maintained, and feared losing. In May 1857, the uprising shattered certainty. It replaced routine with alarm and confidence with doubt. The British response would eventually restore order. But the belief in unquestioned control was gone forever. When news of the uprising reached Britain, the response was immediate and forceful. What began as reports of unrest quickly became a matter of imperial survival. The British government understood that delay would be dangerous. Control had been challenged, and it had to be restored with speed and certainty. Orders were issued without hesitation. Troops were prepared for rapid deployment. Ships were readied in ports, their holds packed with soldiers, weapons, and supplies. The journey would be long, but urgency overrode every obstacle. Reinforcements were not drawn from Britain alone. Across the empire, garrisons were alerted. Units from other colonies were redirected toward India. These forces were accustomed to service far from home, hardened by previous campaigns and demanding conditions. Their presence brought confidence to British commanders, who faced an uncertain and complex situation. As ships crossed oceans, coordination intensified. Military planners worked to integrate incoming forces with those already in India. Supply routes were mapped. Command structures were adjusted. The goal was not merely to reinforce, but to rebuild strength in a disciplined and organized way. Time was critical. Rebel forces controlled key cities and routes. Communication lines had been disrupted. British authority, once widespread, now depended on isolated garrisons holding out under pressure. Every arriving regiment mattered. Within India, loyal units regrouped and prepared to receive reinforcements. Surviving European troops were concentrated at strategic points. Defensive positions were strengthened. Waiting for relief became a test of endurance as much as resolve. The arrival of fresh troops began to change the balance. Columns formed and advanced carefully, retaking territory step by step. Veteran soldiers brought training and coordination that restored momentum. Their discipline contrasted with the fragmented organization of rebel forces. Logistics proved as important as numbers. Weapons, ammunition, and provisions had to move across vast distances. Roads were repaired. Railways, where available, became lifelines. The ability to sustain movement determined success. British commanders adapted their approach. They avoided unnecessary risks and focused on securing key centers first. Cities, supply hubs, and communication routes were prioritized. Control over these points allowed further advances and isolated remaining resistance. As reinforcements continued to arrive, confidence grew within British ranks. The sense of crisis gave way to determination. The empire had committed its resources, and retreat was no longer an option. By late 1857, the scale of mobilization was unmistakable. Britain had assembled a powerful force in India, combining troops from the home country with experienced units from across the empire. The army now possessed both strength and coordination. This concentration of power marked a turning point. The uprising, which had spread rapidly, now faced a disciplined response backed by global resources. Rebel strongholds found themselves under increasing pressure as British forces advanced on multiple fronts. The mobilization also revealed the reach of imperial power. Despite the distance, Britain was able to project force across continents. The speed of response demonstrated the importance India held within the empire. The conflict was no longer local or regional. It had become a contest against the full weight of imperial authority. British forces moved with caution and purpose. Lessons were drawn from early setbacks. Commanders sought to avoid surprises, relying on reconnaissance and intelligence to guide movement. The presence of veteran troops influenced morale on both sides. For rebels, it underscored the scale of opposition they now faced. Yet mobilization came at a cost. The demands of transport, supply, and coordination strained resources. Soldiers endured long marches, extreme heat, and unfamiliar terrain. The campaign required endurance as much as firepower. Still, the momentum shifted steadily. As British columns advanced, resistance was pushed back. Territory once lost was reclaimed. Communication lines reopened. Authority, though shaken, was being rebuilt through force. The rebellion had not been crushed yet, but its fate was sealed. Rapid mobilization proved decisive. It transformed vulnerability into strength and uncertainty into command. The empire had responded with speed, coordination, and overwhelming force. This response reshaped the conflict and its aftermath. The arrival of reinforcements did more than restore military balance. It reasserted the authority of an empire determined to endure. In the months that followed, this power would be used to dismantle resistance and redefine rule. The rapid mobilization of British forces stands as a defining moment. It showed how quickly global power could be assembled, and how decisively it could be applied. By late 1857, Britain was no longer reacting. It was advancing, determined to reclaim control and shape the future that followed. By the summer of 1857, Delhi had become far more than a city. For those who rose against British rule, Delhi represented legitimacy and history. For British commanders, it was the key to restoring control. Whoever held Delhi held the meaning of power. The city's significance reached deep into the past. As the former seat of empire, Delhi carried the weight of centuries. When rebels gathered there, they did not choose it by chance. They believed that reclaiming the old capital would give their cause purpose and unity. The presence of the Mughal court, even in decline, gave the uprising a symbolic center. British forces understood this immediately. The loss of Delhi was not just a military setback. It was a blow to authority. From the moment the city fell into rebel hands, plans were made to take it back. The task would not be easy. The city was heavily defended, and the monsoon heat added to the strain. Skirmishes erupted along roads and riverbanks. Each advance was contested, each position hard-won. By June, British troops began to gather on the outskirts. They faced a determined resistance from within the city walls. The siege settled into a brutal rhythm. British forces established batteries and slowly tightened their grip. Supply lines were stretched, disease spread, and morale was tested. Inside the city, conditions grew desperate. Food became scarce, and fear mixed with defiance. Civilians were caught between two forces, uncertain which future awaited them. Fighting intensified as weeks passed. Artillery fire battered walls that had stood for generations. Streets that once echoed with daily life became battlegrounds. Progress was measured in yards, paid for with exhaustion and loss. The siege was not swift. It was grinding and relentless. As September approached, British commanders prepared for a final assault. They knew delay favored the defenders. Reinforcements arrived, and plans were set with grim determination. The objective was clear. Break through the defenses, retake the city, and shatter the rebellion's heart. In mid-September 1857, the assault began. Troops advanced through breaches under heavy fire. Close fighting erupted as positions changed hands repeatedly. The struggle was chaotic and destructive. Smoke filled narrow lanes. And confusion ruled the streets. Control shifted block by block. Despite fierce resistance, British forces pushed forward. Organization and numbers began to tell. Rebel defenses weakened under sustained pressure. One stronghold after another fell. By the end of the fighting, the outcome was no longer in doubt. Delhi was recaptured. The fall of the city marked a decisive moment. British troops re-established control over the former capital. The rebellion lost its most powerful symbol. What had been a rallying point now became a sign of defeat. The fate of the Mughal court followed swiftly. The emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, was arrested. His authority had been largely ceremonial, though his presence had given the rebellion historical weight. With his arrest, that link to the past was severed. The Mughal dynasty, which had once ruled vast territories, now faded into history. For British rule, this was more than a military victory. It was the elimination of a rival source of legitimacy. News of the recapture spread quickly. For rebels elsewhere, it was a devastating blow. Without Delhi, the uprising lost cohesion. Resistance continued in other regions, but the momentum had shifted. The rebellion no longer had a unifying center. For British authorities, retaking Delhi restored confidence. It demonstrated that control could be reasserted, even after severe challenge. The victory became a turning point in the wider conflict. From this moment onward, suppression would be systematic and relentless. Yet the cost of victory was heavy. The city bore deep scars. Buildings lay damaged, neighborhoods disrupted, and communities shattered. The impact of the siege lingered long after the fighting ended. The recapture also reshaped policy. They recognized the danger of symbols and the power of history. For those who had believed in the rebellion, the fall of Delhi marked the collapse of a dream. The hope that the old order might be restored vanished with the Sitya's capture. What remained was the reality of imperial power reasserted through force. Delhi's role in the uprising ensured its place in history. It had been the heart of resistance, the stage upon which competing visions of authority collided. Its siege and recapture encapsulated the drama of 1857 in a single location. The arrest of the emperor closed the symbolic chapter of the revolt. Without him, the rebellion lost its historical anchor. The rebellion lost its symbolic heart, and with it, much of its power to inspire unity. What followed was the long process of suppression and restructuring. The city that had once crowned emperors had become a battleground, and then a warning. Its fall reminded all who watched that symbols matter in war. And that control over history can be as decisive as control over territory. In the end, Delhi stood as both a witness and a turning point. Its recapture marked the moment when rebellion gave way to defeat. The echo of that September would shape the future of India under British rule. Long after the guns fell silent. The echo of that September would shape the future of India under British rule, long after the guns fell silent. After the fall of Delhi, the rebellion entered a darker and more decisive phase. The symbolic heart of resistance had been retaken, but the conflict was far from over. Across northern India, rebel forces still held major cities and strongholds. British authority understood that control would only be restored through sustained and methodical action. The strategy shifted from reaction to reconquest. Columns of British and Loyalist troops began to move steadily across the region. Their objective was clear. Each remaining center of resistance would be isolated, surrounded, and broken. Kanpur was among the first major targets. The city held strategic importance and deep symbolic meaning. Rebel forces had established control, drawing support from surrounding areas. British commanders approached with caution, aware of the determination they would face. The advance was slow and deliberate. Supply lines were secured before movement continued. Artillery was brought forward with care. Every step reflected lessons learned from earlier setbacks. When fighting began, it was intense. Rebel leaders resisted fiercely, using urban defenses and local knowledge. The struggle for Kanpur was not swift. As Kanpur fell, attention turned toward Lucknow. The city was larger, more complex, and heavily defended. British forces advanced under constant pressure. The terrain favored defenders. Every gain came at a cost. For months, conflict there had drawn national attention. The siege of Lucknow stretched on, marked by exhaustion and persistence. Neither side yielded easily. Rebel fighters drew strength from purpose and desperation. British troops relied on discipline, reinforcement, and resources. Gradually, the balance shifted. Superior organization and supply began to tell. Positions were taken one by one. The city, once a beacon of rebellion, moved closer to collapse. Further south, Jiangxi emerged as another center of resistance. Its leadership inspired loyalty and fierce defense. The fortifications were strong, and the resolve within them stronger still. British forces recognized that Jiangxi would not fall easily. The approach to Jiangxi was calculated and forceful. Artillery was positioned carefully. Encirclement cut off escape and resupply. The siege became a test of will on both sides. Rebel leaders fought with determination, rallying their forces against overwhelming odds. Their resistance slowed the advance and inflicted losses. Yet the imbalance of power was undeniable. As pressure increased, defenses weakened. By early 1858, the pattern had become clear. One rebel stronghold after another was being reduced. The British advance was relentless. There would be no negotiated settlement. Only submission or defeat. Throughout northern India, smaller centers of resistance faced similar fates. Towns were occupied. Villages were searched. Rebel bands were pursued across countryside and forest. Communication improved as British control expanded. Telegraph lines were restored. Supply routes reopened. Authority reasserted itself step by step. The psychological impact of these victories was significant. Each fallen city weakened the rebellion's momentum. Hope faded as coordination became impossible. Rebel forces found themselves isolated and outmatched. British commanders emphasized speed and certainty. They aimed to prevent regrouping or renewed uprising. The cost of this campaign was high. Fighting was prolonged and unforgiving. Both sides endured exhaustion and loss. The conflict left deep scars across the region. By the early months of 1858, organized resistance was largely broken. Major cities were back under British control. Rebel leaders were defeated, dispersed, or captured. The rebellion, once widespread, was now fragmented. Yet silence did not mean peace. The aftermath was tense and uncertain. British authority had been restored, but confidence was shaken. The events of the past year had revealed how quickly control could collapse. For the empire, crushing resistance was a military success but a political warning. Force had prevailed, but trust was gone. Governance would need to change if stability was to last. For the people of northern India, the defeat carried lasting consequences. Cities lay damaged. Communities were divided. Memories of resistance and suppression would endure. By early 1858, the major centers of revolt had fallen. The rebellion no longer threatened the empire's survival. But its impact could not be erased. What followed would redefine British rule. Policies would shift. Attitudes would harden. The memory of resistance would shape every future decision. Crushing of northern India marked the end of open rebellion. It did not mark the end of its meaning. The empire had regained territory. But it had lost certainty. The silence after the sieges was heavy with consequence. Northern India was subdued. But never forgotten. British power in India was never sustained by force alone. Behind the appearance of uniform authority stood a careful system of alliances, rewards, and divisions. When rebellion threatened control, this system became even more visible. Britain did not fight alone. It relied on loyalty, difference, and calculated separation to survive moments of crisis. Across the subcontinent, not all Indian rulers opposed British rule. Some had treaties to protect. Others had rivals to defeat. For many, loyalty was not born of devotion, but of calculation. Aligning with British power offered security, recognition, and survival in an uncertain political landscape. Indian princely states played a significant role in this balance. Rulers who supported the British retained their thrones and authority. Their cooperation was rewarded with protection and status. In return, they provided troops, resources, and strategic support. This relationship created a network of interests tied to the continuation of British rule. Within the army, loyalty was equally complex. While some units rebelled, others remained committed to their commanders. Regimental identities, regional recruitment, and long-standing ties influenced decisions. Soldiers weighed duty, tradition, and consequence. The British understood this landscape well. Rather than confronting rebellion as a single force, they approached it as a collection of local movements. Each region was treated differently. Alliances were strengthened where possible. Resistance was isolated where necessary. This flexibility became a decisive advantage. Regional divisions were carefully used. Differences in language, culture, and leadership were not smoothed over, but emphasized. Communication between rebel groups was disrupted. Suspicion replaced cooperation. Rewards played a central role in sustaining loyalty. Supporters received protection, titles, and continued influence. Those who hesitated were offered reassurance. Those who opposed were isolated. This clear distinction between ally and rebel shaped behavior. A clear distinction between ally and rebel shaped behavior. British strategy focused on breaking momentum. Instead of allowing rebellion to spread unchecked, loyal forces were used to contain it. Loyal forces were used to contain it. Indian troops fought alongside British units against other Indians. Indian troops fought alongside British units against other Indians. This dynamic weakened the moral clarity of resistance, turning conflict into a series of local struggles rather than a unified cause. This dynamic weakened the moral clarity of resistance, turning conflict into a series of local struggles rather than a unified cause. Isolation proved effective. Isolation proved effective. Rebel strongholds were cut off from support. Rebel strongholds were cut off from support. Supply lines were disrupted. Supply lines were disrupted. Intelligence flowed more freely from loyal territories. Intelligence flowed more freely from loyal territories. Without coordination, resistance lost speed and direction. Without coordination, resistance lost speed and direction. Each defeat discouraged neighboring regions from rising. The strategy also affected perception. By presenting rebellion as fragmented and region-specific, British authorities avoided confronting it as a national challenge. This framing influenced policy and response. Control appeared manageable, even when unrest was widespread. This approach weakened the possibility of unified resistance. Without shared leadership, shared communication, or shared reward, rebel groups remained separate. Differences in motivation became barriers. Some fought to restore old kingdoms. Others fought to end foreign rule. These goals did not always align. The British used time as well as division. While rebel forces struggled to coordinate, loyal allies provided stability. Each delay favored the established system. Reinforcements arrived. Plans matured. Pressure mounted gradually rather than explosively. Loyalty was not always absolute or permanent. Some supporters acted out of fear rather than belief. Others calculated risk and reward carefully. British strategy did not require perfect loyalty. It required enough cooperation to prevent unity among opponents. The impact of this approach extended beyond the battlefield. It reshaped relationships within Indian society. Communities were divided by allegiance. Trust weakened. Memory became contested. The aftermath carried social consequences that lasted long after conflict ended. For the British, this strategy reinforced a lesson learned over decades. Rule was sustained not by uniformity, but by managing difference. By rewarding allies and isolating rebels, they maintained control even when challenged by numbers and geography. This method also shaped future governance. Policies emphasized selective inclusion and controlled participation. Representation was limited. Authority remained centralized. The fear of unified resistance influenced decisions long after rebellion was crushed. Understanding the defeat of resistance requires acknowledging this dynamic. Military strength mattered, but strategy mattered more. Divide and loyalty proved more effective than confrontation alone. The rebellion did not fail solely because of force, but because unity could not be achieved. The story is not one of simple betrayal or allegiance. It is a story of complexity under pressure. Rulers and soldiers made choices within constrained circumstances. Survival, ambition, and caution shaped decisions as much as belief. The story is a complex tapestry of human nature, woven under the pressure of war. In the end, the British strategy succeeded. Unified resistance was weakened. Defeat accelerated. Control was restored. Yet the cost was lasting division and mistrust. The method preserved empire in the short term, but deepened fractures beneath the surface. It stands as a central chapter in the story of empire. It reveals how power can endure through strategy rather than strength alone. It shows how resistance can falter when unity is broken. This approach delayed the end of British rule, but it did not erase opposition. Memory endured. Grievance remained. The lesson carried forward into later struggles, where unity became a conscious goal. Divide and loyalty shaped the outcome of rebellion. It accelerated defeat, but also exposed the fragile nature of control built on separation. In this tension lies the deeper legacy of the strategy, one that explains not only how empire survived, but why it was always contested. After the rebellion of 1857 was brought under control, British authority did not settle into calm. Instead, it moved into a phase defined by retribution. The aim was not only to defeat resistance, but to ensure it could never rise again. Punishment became policy, and severity became a message. British commanders believed the uprising had exposed a dangerous weakness. Control had faltered, loyalty had broken, and fear had spread through company territories. To restore confidence, they chose to act with overwhelming firmness. Mercy, many argued, would invite future rebellion. Deterrence required force that could not be misunderstood. Reprisals followed swiftly. Areas suspected of aiding rebels were targeted. Villages accused of sheltering fighters or supplying food were punished as a whole. Homes were destroyed, property seized, and communities dispersed. The goal was collective responsibility. If rebellion touched one household, the entire village would feel the consequence. These actions were meant to send a clear signal. Resistance would not be treated as an isolated crime, but as a threat to order itself. British officers believed that fear could succeed where negotiation had failed. The landscape became a warning, marked by absence and ruin. Executions were carried out publicly. They were designed to be seen, remembered, and spoken of. British authorities wanted examples that would travel faster than rumors. Punishment was staged not in secrecy, but in open spaces where crowds gathered and watched in silence. The intent was psychological as much as physical. Public punishment reinforced the power of the state and the cost of defiance. Officials believed that visible consequences would suppress sympathy for rebellion and discourage future resistance. Fear was expected to restore obedience. For many Indians, these measures were devastating. Entire communities suffered for actions they may not have taken. Guilt was assumed, not always proven. Justice was swift and uncompromising, shaped by urgency rather than careful judgment. British soldiers tasked with enforcing reprisals operated under strict orders. They moved from region to region, carrying out commands meant to reassert authority. Discipline was enforced within the ranks, but emotional strain was common. The scale of punishment weighed heavily, even as it was justified as necessary. The campaign of retribution extended beyond immediate violence. Property confiscation, fines, and forced displacement altered lives long after fighting ended. Families lost land and livelihood. Villages that had existed for generations disappeared from maps and memory. British leadership defended these actions as essential to restoring stability. The rebellion had shocked the empire, and response was shaped by fear of recurrence. In official reports, harsh measures were framed as regrettable but unavoidable. Order, they argued, demanded decisive action. Yet these reprisals carried long-term consequences. While they suppressed open resistance, they deepened resentment. Fear replaced trust, and silence replaced cooperation. Authority was restored, but legitimacy was damaged. The strategy of deterrence rested on a belief that memory would restrain future action. If punishment was unforgettable, rebellion would seem impossible. British officials sought to imprint power onto the landscape and into collective awareness. In the short term, the approach appeared effective. Organized resistance collapsed. Roads reopened. Administration resumed. The empire regained control. But beneath this surface calm, anger endured. Communities remembered loss quietly. Stories passed within families, often unrecorded but deeply felt. The experience of collective punishment shaped how British rule was understood. It was no longer seen as distant or administrative. It was personal and immediate. The harshness of reprisals also influenced British governance. Fear of another uprising led to tighter surveillance, heavier military presence, and reduced trust in Indian institutions. Rule became more cautious, more rigid, and more distant. British policymakers learned a lesson, but not the same one as their subjects. For the rulers, the lesson was that authority must never appear weak. For the ruled, it was that power would be defended without restraint. The aftermath of retribution created a climate of control rather than reconciliation. Cooperation existed, but it was enforced. Stability returned, but it was brittle. Silence filled spaces where dialogue might have grown. Punishment as deterrence reshaped imperial thinking. It justified future policies built on suspicion and force. The memory of rebellion and reprisal lingered, influencing decisions long after the immediate crisis passed. Harsh measures achieved their immediate objective. Victory was secured. Authority was restored. Yet the cost was enduring alienation. The gap between ruler and ruled widened, hardened by experience. British narratives emphasized restored order and necessary discipline. Indian memory emphasized suffering and injustice. These parallel understandings would never fully align. Deterrence through fear created obedience, but not loyalty. It ensured silence, but not consent. The absence of rebellion did not mean acceptance. It meant calculation. In the years that followed, British rule continued under the Crown, shaped by the lessons of 1857. Administration became more centralized. Military readiness increased. Cultural sensitivity was discussed, but authority remained uncompromising. The harsh punishments of the rebellion era became a reference point. They were cited as evidence of resolve and warning. They also became symbols of imperial severity. Retribution closed the chapter of open revolt, but it opened a longer chapter of mistrust. The empire survived, but its relationship with India changed permanently. Victory achieved through fear left scars that did not fade quickly. Villages rebuilt, families recovered, but memory endured. Authority was restored by force, not understanding. Harsh punishments and retribution were meant to end resistance forever. Instead, they reshaped it. Resistance moved inward, into thought, memory, and future ambition. The goal had been deterrence. The result was control without connection. The rebellion was defeated, but the desire for dignity and self-rule was not erased. In restoring order, Britain secured the present. But the methods used shaped the future. The legacy of retribution would echo long after the empire believed the lesson had been learned. When the fighting subsided and resistance was broken, British authority did not return gently. Military victory was followed by a determined effort to reassert control through law, punishment, and unmistakable force. The aim was not only to restore order, but to ensure that rebellion would not rise again. Across affected regions, martial law was imposed. Ordinary legal processes were suspended, replaced by emergency powers. That placed authority firmly in military hands. Commanders acted as judges, administrators, and enforcers. Civil protections faded, and obedience became the primary demand. Trials were conducted swiftly. Accusations moved quickly from arrest to judgment. The goal was speed rather than deliberation. Officials believed delay would invite further unrest. Justice, as it was defined in this moment, served discipline above all else. Sentences were severe. Punishment was meant to be seen and understood. It was intended to send a clear message that defiance carried heavy cost. Law became an instrument of deterrence, designed to restore confidence in authority through fear. Property confiscation followed. Homes, land, and possessions were seized from those accused of supporting resistance. In many cases, entire communities felt the impact. Collective punishment became a tool of control, reinforcing the idea that individual actions could bring consequences for all. Villages suspected of sympathy faced fines, destruction of property, or loss of land rights. Suspicion alone could be enough. The intent was to break networks of support and discourage solidarity. British officials argued that such measures were necessary. The rebellion had exposed vulnerabilities within the system of rule. Restoring authority required more than military success. It required reshaping behavior through strict enforcement. Fear became a governing force. The presence of troops, the speed of punishment, and the uncertainty of accusation created an atmosphere of caution. People learned to avoid gatherings, limit speech, and withdraw into private life. Silence became a form of safety. Law, once presented as a source of fairness and order, now felt distant and unforgiving. Rules were clear, but mercy was rare. Appeals were limited. Authority flowed in one direction, downward, leaving little room for negotiation. The administration worked to formalize this control. New regulations were issued. Surveillance expanded. Records were kept on individuals and communities. The state sought to know who had participated, who had remained loyal, and who might pose future risk. Indian soldiers who had remained loyal were rewarded selectively. Reinforcing divisions. Those suspected of disloyalty were dismissed or punished. The army was reorganized to reduce the chance of future uprising. Trust was replaced by oversight. Civil society felt the strain. Religious leaders, landholders, and local figures were monitored closely. Influence itself became suspect. Any authority outside the state was viewed as a potential threat. British rule re-emerged with a hardened edge. Officials believed firmness would restore stability. They sought to demonstrate that resistance had failed completely, not only in battle, but in consequence. This approach reshaped daily life. Markets reopened under watchful eyes. Travel required permission. Curfews limited movement. The ordinary rhythms of society adjusted to new boundaries set by power. The psychological impact was deep. People remembered not only the events of rebellion, but the response that followed. Fear lingered long after punishments ended. Memory became a silent teacher, guiding behavior through caution. Yet control through fear carried its own risks. While it suppressed open resistance, it did not rebuild trust. Obedience returned, but loyalty did not. Authority was respected, but it was not embraced. British officials believed order had been restored. Roads were secure. Revenue collection resumed. Administration functioned once more. On the surface, stability had returned. Beneath that surface, resentment remained. Punishment had ended rebellion. But it had also reshaped perception. Rule now felt absolute and distant. The gap between ruler and ruled widened further. Law had become an extension of force. It no longer appeared neutral. It was associated with control rather than justice. This association would endure, influencing how authority was understood in the years that followed. The use of collective punishment left lasting scars. Communities remembered loss even when guilt was uncertain. These memories passed quietly from generation to generation, shaping attitudes toward governance and power. British rule after the rebellion rested on discipline and fear, but also on caution. Officials were determined to avoid another uprising. Policies were shaped by suspicion. Inclusion was limited. Control remained the priority. Yet fear could only do so much. It could silence voices, but it could not erase experience. People adapted, endured, and remembered. The surface calm concealed deeper currents of reflection and quiet resistance. Control through fear and law succeeded in restoring order, but it also transformed the relationship between empire and society. Rule became more rigid, more guarded, and more distant. The rebellion had been crushed, but the response ensured it would never be forgotten. Authority was re-established, but at the cost of trust. Discipline prevailed, but consent did not follow. In the years ahead, British India would appear stable once more. Administration would function. Laws would be enforced. Yet beneath this structure lay the memory of a time when law became fear, and fear became governance. This legacy would shape every future interaction between rulers and ruled. Control had been restored, but it rested on foundations hardened by terror. The empire endured, but it did so changed, carrying the weight of its own response long after the guns had fallen silent. By the close of 1857, the rebellion had been crushed. But its consequences were only beginning to unfold. Across India, the smoke of conflict settled over a landscape deeply changed. What the uprising revealed most clearly was not only resistance, but weakness. The system through which a private company governed a vast subcontinent had failed under pressure. For decades, the East India Company had ruled through a mix of trade, military force, and administration. It collected revenue, enforced laws, and commanded armies. On paper, the system appeared efficient and profitable. In reality, it rested on fragile foundations of trust, distance, and assumption. The rebellion exposed these flaws with brutal clarity. British officials in London could no longer ignore the evidence. Reports described administrative blindness, cultural misunderstanding, and rigid leadership. A company driven by profit had been entrusted with the power of a state. When crisis came, it proved incapable of managing the consequences. The uprising of 1857 became a moment of reckoning. How could a corporation rule millions without accountability? Who was responsible when governance collapsed into violence? The answer, increasingly clear, was that company rule itself had reached its end. In 1858, the British government acted decisively. The East India Company was formally dissolved. Its long charter, once a symbol of commercial ambition, was brought to a close. Authority over India was transferred directly to the British Crown. With this decision, one of the most unusual experiments in imperial history came to an end. India now came under direct Crown rule. Power no longer flowed through company directors and shareholders. It moved through the machinery of the state. Ministers, viceroys, and civil servants assumed responsibility for governing the subcontinent. The change was presented as reform. Crown rule promised greater oversight and moral responsibility. The failures of company administration were publicly acknowledged. Proclamations spoke of justice, stability, and respect for Indian traditions. These words were meant to calm a population still shaken by conflict. Administratively, governance was reorganized. The Governor-General became the Viceroy, representing the Crown directly. Departments were restructured, and lines of authority clarified. The Indian civil service expanded its role, becoming the backbone of imperial administration. The military was also reshaped. Lessons from the rebellion influenced recruitment, command, and deployment. British control within the army was strengthened. Indian soldiers continued to form the majority of the ranks, but oversight tightened, and trust was replaced by caution. Despite these changes, the nature of power did not shift dramatically. Decisions remained concentrated in the hands of a small ruling elite. Representation for Indians was limited and carefully controlled. The Raj aimed to be more stable than company rule, not more inclusive. Economically, the foundations of governance remained tied to extraction. Land revenue, taxes, and trade duties continued to support administration and defense. While the company disappeared, the economic logic of empire endured. India's resources still sustained imperial interests. For ordinary people, daily life changed slowly. Officials still collected taxes. Courts still enforced laws. Police maintained order. The symbols of authority were different, but its presence remained constant. Promises of reform felt distant from lived experience. The end of company rule carried deep symbolic meaning. It was an admission that corporate governance had failed. The rebellion had forced Britain to confront the consequences of ruling without consent or understanding. The Crown now carried full responsibility for India, both legally and historically. The beginning of the Raj was shaped by fear as much as reform. British leaders were determined to prevent another uprising. Policies emphasized control, surveillance, and order. Cultural sensitivity was discussed, but often filtered through suspicion. The rebellion had changed Indian perceptions. The idea that British power was unshakable had been challenged. Though defeated, resistance had revealed the limits of authority. This awareness would influence future movements and political thought. The Raj inherited not only territory, but legacy. Decades of company rule had altered land systems, economies, and social relationships. The Crown could not simply erase this past. It had to govern within structures shaped by earlier extraction and distance. For Indian elites and thinkers, Crown rule opened new questions. If governance was now a matter of the state rather than a company, could appeals be made to justice, rights, and reform? These questions would grow louder over time. The British Raj began with the promise of learning from rebellion. Officials spoke of restraint, balance, and responsibility. Yet the tension between control and consent remained unresolved. Stability was achieved, but at the cost of trust. The end of company rule did not end opposition. Instead, it transformed it. Resistance shifted from corporate misrule to imperial authority itself. The focus moved from the failures of a company to the legitimacy of empire. In 1858, a chapter closed. The East India Company passed into history, its legacy etched into institutions and landscapes. The British Raj took its place, carrying both the lessons and the burdens of rebellion. The rebellion had exposed weakness, and Britain responded with consolidation. The Raj was built not only on power, but on the memory of crisis. The end of company rule stands as a moment when empire changed its form, but not its purpose. The rebellion had exposed dangerous weaknesses in both the army and the administration. Control had collapsed faster than expected, and recovery had been costly. When order was restored, the priority was clear. This must never happen again. The first focus was the Indian Army. Once the backbone of British authority, it had also been the source of rebellion. Trust had been broken, and the military system had to be reshaped from its foundations. Rebuilding began with structure, discipline, and control. Recruitment patterns changed immediately. The British abandoned earlier methods that relied heavily on specific regions and units. They believed concentration had allowed solidarity to form. Solidarity had become dangerous. New recruitment favored diversity and separation. Soldiers were drawn from different regions, communities, and backgrounds. Units were deliberately mixed to prevent shared identity from becoming shared resistance. Balance replaced unity as the guiding principle. Certain regions were labeled more reliable. Punjab and frontier areas became key recruitment zones. These choices reflected British assumptions about loyalty and military temperament. Whether accurate or not, these beliefs shaped the new army. The ratio between British and Indian soldiers also changed. The presence of British troops was increased. This shift ensured that command and firepower remained firmly in imperial hands. Indian soldiers still formed the majority. But the balance of control was adjusted. Artillery was treated differently from all other arms. The rebellion had shown its destructive potential when used against authority. After 1858, artillery was kept almost entirely under British control. Indian access was limited and tightly supervised. Training was standardized and intensified. Drill emphasized obedience, hierarchy, and separation from civilian life. Soldiers were encouraged to see themselves as professionals, not as representatives of society. The goal was loyalty to command above all else. Military intelligence became a priority. Officers were trained to observe not just performance, but attitude. Rumors, grievances, and unusual behavior were monitored closely. Silence was no longer interpreted as contentment. At the same time, administration underwent major reform. The East India Company was dissolved, ending merchant rule. Authority passed directly to the British Crown. This change symbolized a new seriousness in governance. Centralization became the guiding principle. Power was concentrated in fewer hands, with clearer lines of authority. Decision-making moved upward. Local autonomy was reduced in favor of imperial oversight. Surveillance expanded across the administrative system. Reports flowed regularly from districts to provincial centers. Officials were required to document conditions, behavior, and sentiment. Information became a tool of prevention. Communication networks were strengthened. Telegraph lines were extended across the subcontinent. Railways expanded rapidly. These systems allowed faster response to unrest and quicker movement of troops. Law enforcement was reorganized as well. Police forces were expanded, professionalized, and placed under closer supervision. Their role was to detect trouble early and suppress it before it spread. Order was no longer reactive. It was anticipatory. Administrative boundaries were reviewed and adjusted. District officers were given wide authority, but also strict accountability. They were expected to know their regions in detail. Ignorance was no longer an excuse. Indian participation in administration increased cautiously. Educated Indians were appointed to clerical and subordinate roles. Their knowledge improved efficiency, but real authority remained limited. Inclusion was allowed, but control was not surrendered. Legal systems were strengthened to support governance. Courts expanded, procedures standardized, and regulations tightened. Economic administration followed the same logic. Revenue systems were refined to ensure steady income. Financial stability was seen as essential to political control. Throughout these reforms, memory guided policy. Every official action was shaped by the events of 1857. The rebellion was not treated as an exception. It was treated as a warning. British officials believed prevention depended on vigilance. Small signs of unrest were taken seriously. Public gatherings were watched. Political activity was monitored. The rebuilt system aimed to remove surprise. Nothing should emerge unnoticed. Nothing should grow unchecked. The empire sought to make resistance visible before it became dangerous. On the surface, the reforms brought stability. The army remained loyal. Administration functioned smoothly. Revenue flowed, and order appeared restored. Yet beneath this stability lay tension. Control had increased, but trust had not returned. Authority relied more heavily on surveillance and separation. Confidence was replaced by caution. For Indians, the changes were unmistakable. The state felt heavier, closer, and more intrusive. Every aspect of life seemed observed and regulated. The empire ruled carefully, but firmly. The rebuilding of the army and administration succeeded in its immediate goal. Large-scale rebellion did not return for decades. But the cost of this success was distance between ruler and ruled. Governance became efficient, but emotionally hollow. The empire prepared itself against future uprisings with precision and memory. It learned from crisis and adapted quickly. But adaptation did not mean reconciliation. After 1858, British rule survived through structure rather than trust. The empire had rebuilt its defenses. Yet the fear that shaped those defenses never fully faded. And that shadow would influence the future long after the rebuilding was complete. Britain emerged from the rebellion with military victory firmly in hand. Organized resistance was defeated, strongholds were retaken, and authority was reasserted across the regions that had risen in defiance. On maps and in reports, order appeared restored. Yet victory carried a weight that could not be measured in territory alone. The cost was immense, even for those who prevailed. Resources were drained by prolonged campaigns and emergency responses. Administration was disrupted. Confidence was shaken. The rebellion had exposed how vulnerable control could become when trust failed. Though force succeeded, certainty did not return with it. In the immediate aftermath, the landscape of governance changed tone. Authority hardened. Surveillance increased. Policies were redesigned to prevent unity among the ruled. The lesson drawn by the rulers was not reconciliation, but caution. Stability would be maintained through oversight rather than assumption. Trust between rulers and ruled was permanently damaged. Before the rebellion, British authority had relied on a belief in cooperation and loyalty, especially within the army and among local elites. Afterward, that belief was replaced by suspicion. Every gesture was weighed. Every action was examined for hidden intent. The relationship shifted from partnership to control. For many Indians, the defeat did not bring acceptance. It brought clarity. The rebellion had revealed the limits of dialogue within the existing system. Grievances that had been dismissed were now understood as dangerous. The space for compromise narrowed, even as awareness expanded. The rebellion ended, but resistance did not. Open confrontation gave way to quieter methods. Ideas circulated where armies once marched. Memory replaced momentum. The experience of challenge became part of collective understanding, carried forward in stories and reflection. British rule adapted in response. Administration became more centralized. Authority flowed more directly from the highest levels. The East India Company disappeared, replaced by Crown governance. This change was framed as reform, yet it was driven by fear of repetition. Military organization was reshaped with care. Recruitment patterns shifted. Command structures were adjusted. Cultural sensitivities were acknowledged more formally, though often without deeper inclusion. The army remained strong. But its relationship with those it commanded was altered. Public life reflected this transformation. Representation remained limited and controlled. Participation was offered cautiously, designed to manage rather than empower. The empire sought to rule with fewer surprises, even if that meant ruling with greater distance. The cost of victory was also social. Communities were divided by allegiance and memory. Suspicion lingered long after conflict ceased. The scars of disruption did not heal quickly. The sense of shared future weakened, replaced by parallel experiences of authority and subjection. For the rulers, victory demanded justification. Official narratives emphasized restoration of order and protection of stability. The rebellion was presented as an exception rather than a symptom. This framing allowed governance to continue without addressing deeper causes. But it left unresolved tension beneath the surface. For the ruled, the meaning was different. The rebellion became a reference point, a reminder that power could be challenged. And that sacrifice carried consequence. Even in defeat, it altered how authority was perceived. Obedience was no longer assumed as natural or permanent. Over time, resistance evolved into organized political thought. Demands for inclusion, rights, and representation drew indirectly from the lessons of the rebellion. The belief that force alone could not secure dignity gained strength. The memory of 1857 informed later strategies that favored unity, dialogue, and mass participation. British rule continued, but it did so under a shadow. The confidence of earlier decades was gone. Every policy carried awareness of past rupture. Control required constant maintenance. The empire endured, but it did not feel unassailable. Victory changed the nature of rule forever. It replaced ease with vigilance. It substituted trust with regulation. It reshaped governance into a system designed to prevent uprising rather than foster belonging. The rebellion had forced this transformation, even in defeat. This legacy shaped the decades that followed. Infrastructure expanded. Administration refined itself. Yet the emotional distance between ruler and ruled widened. Stability was preserved. But consent was not deepened. The cost of control remained embedded in daily life. The rebellion also reshaped identity. It clarified lines between authority and aspiration. It taught both sides that power is relational, dependent on perception as much as force. When perception shifts, power must adapt or erode. In the long view, military victory proved temporary in its effect. The deeper consequences endured. The rebellion altered expectations, hardened positions, and planted questions that would grow over time. It did not end resistance. It redirected it. History often records who won and who lost. The rebellion challenges that simplicity. Britain won the battles, but lost the ease of rule. India lost the uprising, but gained awareness and resolve. The outcome was not a conclusion, but a transformation. Victory came with lasting consequences. It secured control, but at a price that reshaped governance and memory alike. The rebellion ended on the ground, but continued in the mind. And in that continuation lay the seeds of future change, carried forward by a society that had learned the true cost of power enforced without trust. How Britain crushed the rebellion of 1857 reveals the true nature of imperial power. Victory was achieved through force, fear, and division. The rebellion failed, but it left scars that never healed. Understanding this chapter of history reminds us that control achieved by violence is never permanent. Thank you for listening. And for walking through this powerful moment in history. May remembering the past help us understand the cost of empire. Until next time. Take care, and stay curious.